My presentation today will be on politics and finance. I'm going to try to share my screen. I think it's shared, and I will use a full-size format. I'm going to start giving you a bit of a broader perspective on the topic. And I thought that a couple of statements are going to be a very useful starting point. So the first statement I want to make is that across the globe, governments intervene and exert extensive influence over businesses and business activities. Some scholars have tried to justify government intervention based on the presumption that markets are subject to failures. So you can think of externalities, monopolies, and so forth, traditional market failures. And these economists typically see government intervention as a way to cure these market failures. Second statement I want to make is that it's also the case, it's not only governments exercising influence over firms, but it's also the case that the firms as well as individuals, at least some, are in a position and have sufficient power to shape the political process itself. This observation has given rise to some concerns, at least by some scholars. And the specific concern is that the influence of individuals could give rise actually to market failures and could also give rise to distortions. And so overall the question is, well, there are several questions that can be addressed, but is obviously whether government intervention is a source of failures or is a cure to market failures. The way that governments intervene is actually in multiple forms. Perhaps a very traditional form of intervention that we typically study in finance is in the form of taxation. And so I decided to prepare a little slide displaying the evolution of the top statutory corporate income tax rates in the last 40 years. This is just about the G7 countries, so that we can have a sense about this evolution without having a slide that is overwhelmingly crowded. So what we definitely observe is that corporate income tax rates have gone down in the past 40 years, but governments do extract a non-trivial share of corporate profits through a tax intervention. Back in the 80s, across the G7 countries, the average corporate income tax rate was 50%. Now it's slightly less than 30%, but it's basically 1/3 of the profits generated by corporations. Again, we can think of this intervention as a way to collect some rents, perhaps monopolistic or oligopolistic rents, and redistributing them to society, but one also alternative way to think of government intervention, and certainly a way we think about it in finance, is taxation being a possible friction that gives rise to reactions by firms. So taxes are not the only way that governments intervene and interact with companies. Obviously, regulation is another classical form of intervention. Other extreme ways would involve expropriation by politicians. Think of governments occasionally, or in some countries frequently, seizing private property, sometimes without compensation. We know that governments in many instances intervene massively in economic activity through the operations of state-owned enterprises. And then forms of intervention that perhaps are less visible, but certainly often the topic of attention by scholars and the media would involve things such as corruption, lobbying, campaign contributions, and the corporate political connections, which is going to be the focus of most of my talk today, in part motivated by some of the work I have done. So in general, the extent of interaction between government and firms is quite pervasive. In some instances, or with respect to some of these forms of intervention, the government is in control. You can think of politicians being in control of the decisions. But in other instances, firms, as well as perhaps voters, there are definitely many constituencies in this kind of game, may be able to exert sufficient pressure to distort these decisions to their benefit. So what are the questions that we typically see or ask in our finance research? Well, there are two broader types of questions that I generally see. And so the first is how prevalent, how common is a particular type of interaction? For example, how often or in how many cases do governments have corporate income taxation? And there we can say that in most cases, governments do have corporate income taxes, the lone exceptions being famous or infamous tax havens. Or if we are thinking about corporate political connections, how common are those? Should we see more of them or should we see less? And the second typical question in finance is how does particular type of intervention by government or pressure action by firms contribute to firm value? And so sticking to the example of taxes, we can probably would expect an increase in the corporate income tax rate, holding everything else constant, to have a negative impact on the value of firms. And if so, if such activity is detrimental, then what will firms do to react and mitigate this negative effect? So in finance, typical question that we ask is the extent to which perhaps companies are going to use capital structure choices and use leverage to shield some income from corporate taxes. In accounting, people would ask a more broad question about what type of tax strategies and income sheltering devices firms put in place to mitigate the impact of taxation. In some cases, government intervention is beneficial to firm value, at least for some of the firms. That would be the case of corporate political connections, at least on average. And when that's the case, the typical questions that we ask are, what are the sources of value increase and what are the possible costs associated with corporate political ties? So this is, again, just to give you a starting point, a broad view about research on finance and politics or interactions between firms and governments. But what I will spend most of my time on today are going to be corporate political connections. And so I think a useful starting point is to provide a definition of corporate political connections. And I will use a definition that I have used in my own work and I have seen used in practice quite a few times. This definition has practical reasons for being spelled out this way, but a common way to approach questions related to corporate political connections is to define a company as politically connected when some of its major stakeholders, and more specifically large shareholders, block holders, controlling shareholders, officers and or directors, is a member of a parliament or a government minister. Occasionally, some studies have looked at instances of involvement in local politics. So including the US, the case would be governors or mayors and so forth. And the types of questions investigated when we focus on corporate political connections tend to be the following. One, prevalence. And so we'll show you some results about the extent of pervasiveness of corporate political connections across countries based on my first paper on this topic. The second is impact on value. The third is costs associated with this type of interaction with government. Obviously, there will be almost certainly some costs and benefits. And obviously, the question of impact on value is whether costs exceed the benefits or vice versa. I decided to organize the presentation and provide some examples of research on the topic, focusing on my own work for a couple of reasons. The first is that I'm obviously very familiar with it. And the second is to the extent that I instead chose somebody else's work, I would obviously end up making some judgment call and in a way showing a preference for somebody versus somebody else's. There has been a tremendous amount of work done on these questions, a lot of excellent work. And so by mostly focusing on what I have done, I will avoid trying to give the impression that some scholars have done great work and perhaps implicitly give the impression that I think less of other people's work. You should not take any of my statements in that sense. So, prevalence of political connections. So this is a picture based on my 2006 papers, where darker colors mean that in a country, corporate political connections are more prevalent. In this case, what I found at the time was that corporate political connections, or the market capitalization of politically connected firms as a fraction of the total market cap of a given country, was especially high in some parts of the world. Russia was the most extreme case, where over 80% of the market cap involves companies with political connections. You can definitely see darker colors when we move here to Southeast Asia, the UK, Italy, and then all the rest tends to actually be pretty light in color. Overall, at the time, I found that when defining corporate political connections according to the strict definition that I displayed in the previous slide, about 10% of the world market cap involved companies that had a member of parliament or a member of government as a key shareholder, somebody owning more than 10% of the firm, an officer, or as a director. So a conclusion is that perhaps corporate political connections are kind of prevalent, sufficiently prevalent to deserve some kind of attention. You probably don't know, but at the time I did this study, a big motivation were articles that were appearing in many of the major newspapers following essentially the election of Italian then Prime Minister Berlusconi, starting back in the late 90s. Silvio Berlusconi is a very, very wealthy entrepreneur, has been in the list of world billionaires for decades, and at some point in his career decided to step into politics. He was elected as a member of parliament, and then he was selected as Prime Minister of Italy. At the time, there was a lot of criticism in the press, both the Italian as well as the foreign press, trying to address the question of possible abuses, alleged abuses, related to the possibility that somebody in such great power, such a concentration of both economic and political power, could try to use his political role to shape decisions that were beneficial to his companies. If we were putting those decisions in that situation, we would presume that many of us would have the temptation to benefit ourselves. I mean, as rational economic agents, That would be some major temptation to consider. And so a question that I addressed in my work was the extent to which these corporate political connections, when formed, would affect the value of a company. And so in order to try to investigate the impact on value, I had to make a few decisions. One was an empirical decision. How do we measure the impact on value? And my choice was, well, to the extent that we have events that are clean, that are not anticipated, and that generate a sharp discontinuity in the extent to which a company is or is not politically connected, we can use those events in an event study setting to try to get a sense of the extent to which these connections, their creation, in this case, in the case of this paper, adds or subtract to firm value in net terms on average. So after deciding to focus on an event study, then the question is, what is the event? And given that I knew when connections were present, I thought that an obvious event to consider was to determine the time of establishment of a connection. And there were obviously two types of connections that could be included and were included in the sample. One was an instance like Mr. Berlusconi, in which a business person seeks election to a political office and perhaps makes it. So an entrepreneur entering politics. And the second possibility, alternative possibility, is a politician being offered some kind of a position in a company. So it could be being elected or appointed to the board of directors, being appointed to a top executive position, perhaps even a less visible position, except they wouldn't see those, or maybe even being offered a big chunk of ownership in a company in the hope that this will generate enough returns so that benefits exceed the costs. So what I was able to do was to identify the date of establishment of a connection, meaning an entrepreneur entering politics or a politician getting a position in a company, for which I also had data on stock prices for companies. The data came from DataStream at the time of the creation of a connection. And further, I wanted these events to be not anticipated. And so in many cases, the events is the election to a political role of a business person. So I required the election outcome to be a surprise. And so I did a bunch of keywords while looking at media, describing the electoral results, requiring a surprise element to the electoral outcome. Obviously, we don't want to work with events that are largely anticipated because otherwise it becomes very difficult to interpret the stock price reaction to these events. At the limit, there wouldn't be any stock price reaction at all, which would defeat the whole purpose of doing our event study. So what I found for all the connections for which I had the event dates, stock prices, and I could determine that there was a surprise element, that the creation of a political connection gave rise to an average stock price increase. This stock price increase was statistically significant, in a way a bit borderline. Certainly the number of events was kind of limited given all the restrictions that I had to impose. Recall that there were two types of events. One is a politician appointed to a corporate position, and one is a business person entering politics. The incentives in the two cases are very different, right? Politician who is appointed to a board only gets a fixed salary. Sometimes, in fact, they may not even get a compensation. And so for them, the incentive to be actively engaged as a politician, perhaps shaping political decisions to benefit the company in which they have limited stake is kind of reduced. And in fact, perhaps not surprisingly, I didn't find any stock price increase, at least on average, for those appointments. On the other hand, business people entering politics, especially owners of companies, would have a lot of vested interests to use their political position later on to help shape the environment in a way that is beneficial to their firms. And indeed, they found a fairly large stock price reaction to the announcement that a corporate person was elected to a political office. There are obviously many ways to split the sample. I will just show you a few examples and then move to the next item on the agenda. But obviously, incentives are different depending on whether the person who gets elected to political office is the owner of a company versus is simply a director of the company. And indeed, we find a much larger price impact for elections of corporate owners, although I must point out that the number of observations was somewhat limited. We would expect, to the extent that this is reflecting the political power of the person, a reaction to be larger in magnitude when the person lends to a more powerful political position. And so I compared elections to simple members of parliament with elections to government ministers. And indeed, I found that having more power as a government minister rather than just a typical member of parliament was associated with much more sizable stock price reaction. And last, I split between a more corrupt and less corrupt countries. The idea was to think as to whether these results, how do we interpret them? Can we interpret them in a way that is consistent with abuse of public power for personal gain? Well, if so, we would expect this abuse to be more prevalent, where the stock price reaction to be more positive, where we know that abuses tend to be more prevalent, meaning in more corrupt countries, at least on average. And indeed, I found that the value of corporate political connections was much higher when corruption was high, and quite negligible in countries with low corruption. So it appeared, based on these results, that the political connections were value adding. Obviously, there could have been many reasons why this value is going up. My interpretation, my preferred interpretation, has to do with the political role exerted by these individuals once they become politicians. But there can be alternative interpretations as well. For example, to the extent that there are information asymmetries, the election to a political office by an entrepreneur can be revealing information about the entrepreneur's quality. Now we know that he's better. He was even able to make it to an important political office. And if that were the case, obviously the stock price increase would not really stem from the political power of the individual, but rather from a revelation of the abilities of this person as an entrepreneur. So there have been a lot of other event studies done by a variety of people, and this is going to be the only slide in which I mention other authors. I'm just going to mention a few to give you a sense of the flavor of what is done. And so what these other colleagues have done is also to focus on events that were surprises and which generated a sharp discontinuity in the presence of connections. In some cases, these events maintained intact the information that we knew about the quality of the individual as an entrepreneur. So one of such events, which was kind of, very negative, obviously, historical event, is the the rise to power of the Nazi Party in Germany. And these two authors looked at companies that were well known to have a pre-existing ties to the party, and they look at how their value evolved during the initial few months in which the Nazis went to power. They documented a very, very large positive impact on the value of firms connected to the party. So that's also a case of creation of a connection, but in this case, the company was already known to have these ties. There is a shock to the political power of the party in question. Second type of example is a kind of the reverse. And so an event that diminishes the connection. And so Fishman and co-authors looked at events involving the health of politicians. So in the first paper, Ray looked at events involving deterioration in the health of then Indonesian President Suharto, and found that deterioration in the health that obviously cannot be conveying possibly any news or new information about the quality of Suharto's children as entrepreneurs, generated a large negative impact on the value of companies that were tied to the Indonesian president. Fishman et al. Look at the heart attacks of Dick Cheney. In that paper, they do not find any impact associated with the heart attacks of Dick Cheney on companies that were tied to him through board connections. Roberts and myself with David Parsley looked perhaps at the most extreme type of event that you can think of, which was the unexpected death of politicians. So Roberts looked at Senator Scoop Jackson in the US. In my paper with David, we look at the unexpected surprise death of over 100 politicians across a lot of different countries. So the political connection here was already in place. So the death of the politician cannot convey any information about the quality of the firms, because that was already revealed when the connection was formed. And what both studies find is evidence of a large negative impact associated with the termination of political connections. Again, these are just a few examples. There are several dozens papers that have looked at a variety of events and have provided typically evidence consistent with connections being value increasing. I think if I have to select exceptions, the main exception that comes to my mind are studies of political connections in China. In China, it appears from many studies that connections do not add value on average to connected firms. So, but sticking with the majority of evidence where political connections add value, then two natural questions are: what are the benefits and perhaps what are the costs involved in creating these ties? Obviously, to the extent that connections are very valuable, in fact, in economics, there is a bigger question of why there isn't more money in politics, given how large returns to political investment appear to be. The questions of benefits and costs are going to be quite important. So I will start with an overview of possible costs, and these are, again, just examples. I'm perhaps a bit creative, having grown up in Italy and having experienced and seen corruption with my own eyes. But I'm sure that there are other types of costs that I'm neglecting. So typical costs could involve things such as cash payments to politicians, gifts, jobs for politicians, corporate jobs for their families, for their friends, corporate jobs for other government bureaucrats, support to politicians in a variety of ways. Obviously, the politician is going to maximize his or her own utility. Maximizing their utility could involve things such as remaining in their political office, and things that are going to help with the politician achieving that goal would involve campaign contributions, possibly, as well as vote buying. For example, we know that politicians are more likely to be re-elected when the economy does well, when unemployment is low. Unemployed people tend to get upset, angry, and will often exhibit a tendency to vote against the incumbent politician. And so we can even think of companies potentially boosting, at least temporarily, employment around elections in the hope of facilitating the re-election of their connected politician. And this is the question that I investigated in one of my papers with Scott Shue. So what we did in that paper is to look at one cost of political connections in a setting where we know that employment is a vicious issue. And the setting is buyouts by private equity firms. Literature in finance had documented that buyouts by private equity firms tend to be followed by quite sizable job cuts. When looking at at firms' buyout targets in aggregate, these job cuts have been documented to be really large, more than 10% of the workers' force. And more recently, when looking at employment at the plant level, therefore ignoring the plants that are sold, which would give the appearance of job cuts at the firm level, people have found more modest evidence of job cuts, but still some. So there has been some controversy around the buyouts. Often they are described with a negative view in the press. You may recall presidential elections in the US when Mitt Romney ran for elections. He was often aggressively criticized because of his experience in the private equity industry, and also because this industry being so negatively denoted because of job destruction. Importantly, political connections are very widespread in the private equity industry, especially among the largest private equity firms. And so we are in a situation where private equity firms have political ties. Hopefully, the ties are being used to some extent to their benefit, but there is a possibility that these politically connected firms might, during some years, have to pay back the politicians for the favors that they are being provided. And so we are going to look at employment cycles following buyouts versus pre-buyouts, and how these cycles vary over time as we approach elections. So what we did was essentially to use broadly, general difference in different settings. So we are comparing employment pre and post buyout for two different types of targets: those that are bought by private equity firms that have a politician in a key position, and those that are bought by private equity firms that do not have politicians in a top position. So for both sets of targets, they are both selected to be buyout targets. We look at the change in employment around at the time of buyout, and we compare whether there are differences in employment changes depending on whether the acquiring private equity firm is politically connected or not, and whether there are bigger differences that are any to start with around election times. So we used a variety of empirical methodologies. The very first set of papers on political connections were simply making cross-sectional comparisons between politically connected companies and unconnected ones. Obviously, we have gone a long way since those earlier studies. Obviously, in the last 20, 30 years, more and more attention has been put in addressing a variety of endogeneity issues, including selection issues. And with richer data, we have over time been able to address some of these concerns. And for example, what we did in this paper have panel regressions with a target firm fixed effects, or even a plant fixed effects and year fixed effects. Use propensity score matching to make sure that we keep the targets of politically connected and unconnected private equity firms as similar as possible, at least based on what we can observe. And we also use the placebo tests involving firms that became targets of buyouts by private equity firms, where the buyout was announced, but eventually did not complete for reasons that were plausibly exogenous. That's to mitigate the concern of selection. If what we are picking up is just the result of selection, we should see the same results among targets of buyouts that did not complete. And in fact, we don't, contrary to the idea that it's only selection what we are picking up. So what do we find? We found that job destruction that is typically observed following buyouts was significantly less severe among buyouts that were undertaken by private equity firms that had political connections. In fact, these companies were on average marginally increasing the number of employees. Importantly, these results, consistent with an exchange of favors story, were more pronounced when there was a greater incentive for the politician to appropriate some rents. Politician needs the votes during election years, not every year. And so if there is an exchange of favors, we would expect to see a greater incidence of favors or a greater magnitude of favors when the incentives to make the exchange are greater. So we do see this in election years. We saw more of this in states that had a higher extent of a perceived or observed corruption. We also saw and documented the benefits that were accruing to politically connected firms after the elections. And so this evidence was both consistent with the sharing of benefits between politicians and firms, consistent with the version of a quid pro quo story where firms provide some benefits in the form of employment to politicians. When the politician is running for re-election, politician benefits because he or she gets re-elected and then pays back the firm in a way. I started with the costs, but obviously given that most of the evidence tends to, at least on average, indicate that political connections in net terms add to firm value, I will conclude talking a bit about the sources of benefits. Obviously, the benefits on average are exceeding costs, at least for the average firm. So what are the benefits? So on benefits of political connections, there is actually very rich literature. The very first set of papers were papers documenting preferential access to capital. And this was observed in a couple of major ways. One was companies with political connections, holding everything else constant, having greater access typically to debt capital, sometimes even to equity capital than companies without political connections. Also, some studies provide evidence that these companies were getting access to that capital at interest rates that were lower than non-connected firms, despite the fact that the companies with political connections were less likely to pay back the loans, something that was consistent with possible misallocation of resources. Some scholars even provided evidence of this apparent preferential treatment of politically connected firms in access to capital being more pronounced in countries where government-owned banks were more prevalent. You can also think of looking into preferential access to government contracts. Again, there are a few studies on that. Preferential access to government bailouts when the company becomes financially distressed. We saw that my paper with Ron and John. There are papers on TARP. There are even recent papers about the use of PPP money during the COVID crisis. We can think, and scholars have looked at lenient enforcement by government agencies. Something I looked at in a recent paper with Luigi Zingales is perhaps even the more dramatic extreme of regulatory capture. What do we mean by regulatory capture? Well, we mean incumbent firms, so firms that are currently operating in the market, having possibly sufficient power to shape the design of regulations to limit entry of competitors. Obviously, to the extent that a firm can avoid to compete, they might well prefer that. We know that monopolists and oligopolists realize profits that are greater than they would under a competitive market. So everybody would have an incentive to be in a monopoly, especially when they can secure a legal monopoly through the capture of regulators for the purpose of having regulations that de facto impede entry of new competitors. So to address the question of capture, regulatory capture, we focused on one industry, which was the mobile telecommunication industry. This industry is in many ways quite incredible. The largest two operators across over 150 countries control over 80% of the market. In many countries, still to date, there is just one operator. Don't think of a natural monopoly. It's no natural monopoly at all. These are all legal monopolies. This industry is interesting and relevant for many reasons. For example, I think that if not all of us, most of us have a cell phone. This industry is very interesting topic of study for the purpose of investigating regulatory capture because it's highly regulated. It's highly regulated at national level. Even in the European Union, regulations are set by national regulatory agencies. It's nationally segmented, so you cross the border, you end up with a different carrier. It's heavily dependent on access to the spectrum, where access to the spectrum is entirely controlled by the government. So the government has a lot of power to decide who enters the market and who does not. Interestingly, the product that we get when we buy a cell phone is very similar across countries. We're going to make a phone call. 1 minute phone call is the same in the US, in India, in China, or in a less developed country. Or think of access to the internet. 1 gigabyte of data is the same everywhere. So we have a product that is highly comparable. We are not comparing a cancer medicine with one that treats cholesterol. We also have very granular data from many different sources, which minimizes the risk that there might be distortions that look like capture that we see in the data that are actually coming because of some biases in reporting of data, either by the operators, so the cell phone carriers, or the regulators, or the customers, and so forth. So In order to investigate the question of regulatory capture, we did three things. So first, put together a measure of regulation. What we care is a measure of regulation that we can rank so that we can determine the extent to which the regulation in place in a country, which is obviously a choice, a political choice made by the regulators, is protective of consumers or rather protective of incumbents. We were actually very fortunate that the job of developing an index of regulation was done for us by the International Telecommunication Union. What the International Telecommunication Union has done for over a decade was to run questionnaires annually, send it to regulatory authorities in each country. And in these questionnaires, they were asking 50 different questions, 42 of which are related to regulatory choices. So we are going to focus on the 42 questions in the questionnaire related to regulatory choices. To give you some example, questions would involve something like, who owns a phone number once you have a cell phone contract? Is it you as the customer? Meaning, if you switch carrier, you can take your number with you? Or is it the carrier? So that if you switch carrier, you need to get a new number. Obviously, this is a major impediment if you need to change the number to switching the carrier. And so limits competition in the industry. As the owner of a cell phone and having a contract with the carrier, do you need to use the carrier to make your phone calls, let's say to Italy, as I often do with my family? Or can you use a voice over the internet, for example, Skype, which tends to be much, much cheaper than using the carrier? In many cases, regulations restrict the ability of a client to use voice over the internet. In other cases, the regulations mandate carriers to allow of voice over the internet usage or availability. In some cases, there are regulations that still to date restrict the ability of foreigners to have a sufficient ownership in local phone carriers. Something I found quite surprising and in many ways shocking. In other cases, foreign ownership and foreign entry is permitted. So the regulations vary a lot in the extent to which competition is allowed or even in a way forced by the regulation or instead restricted. And obviously it's entirely political choice, the extent to which a country will want to restrict competition or favor competition. So the regulatory score I'm going to use in our analysis, and we used in our analysis, and I'm going to show you in a plot that needs to be read such that higher value or a darker color means a regulation that is more pro-competition. Lighter color is a regulation that is more against competition, meaning for the protection of existing cell phone carriers. So we had data on regulation for almost 150 countries, so very, very rich data set, and 10 years of data. Because we have a panel of data, we were able to go beyond the simple cross-sectional comparison, exploit time series changes in regulations and determinants or outcomes, as well as case studies to make stronger case for the idea or the question of whether regulatory choices are captured by incumbents and shaped to protect their position. So this graph essentially is a representation of regulations in 2013. It's just one of the years in the sample. You see that there is a lot of variation. Yellow denotes a lack of data on regulation. Simply, those countries did not respond to the ITU questionnaire. Darker colors mean regulations, again, that are more pro-competition. Lighter colors mean regulations that are instead more protective of incumbents. Now, before I show you what shapes the design of regulations, what factors play a role, I want to show you that these regulations are not a matter of indifference. They are relevant for many outcomes. Take it with quotes, outcomes. I don't mean it in a causal sense. Obviously, we only have time series correlations, but they are associated with observations that are kind of relevant. So we see that regulations that are more pro-competition seem to be associated with less concentration in this industry. They seem to be concentrated with what regulatory authorities perceive as higher competition. This is mostly a sanity check, but it's always worthwhile to check that we meet the sanity bar when we can run such a check. Regulations that are more pro-competition tend to be associated with significantly lower prices for cell phone products like calls or bundles of calls and internet access. And they tend to be associated with lower margins for the incumbents. And so in a way, regulations that are more pro-competition are beneficial to customers. We pay less for our monthly cell phone contract, but they tend to be detrimental to the incumbents. One may wonder whether perhaps we pay less, but we get something that is worse. So we looked at other measures of perhaps quality. So for example, coverage with a 3G or 4G, which was the standard at the time of our study. We actually find that the regulations that are more pro-competition are associated with better quality for the customers, not worse. They are not associated with lower investment, as carriers would often argue. It's a very common argument by carriers that their industry involves very large fixed investments, and regulations that incentivize competition make it more difficult for them to invest. We certainly don't see evidence of that in the data, at least on average. And it's also the case that the regulations that are more pro-competition are not detrimental to employees of cell phone carriers. It's not the case that companies tend to save money by cutting jobs. Rather, we see higher levels of employment. So regulations that are pro-competition have obviously important redistributive effects. Again, take the word effect not in a causal sense. I need to use some term for the sake of the presentation, but they seem to be beneficial for customers. They seem instead to be detrimental for incumbents. So obviously the incumbent operators have no interest to pursue or push for regulations that are pro-competition, but rather would have an interest, possibly a tendency, to attempt, to the extent that they can, to influence the design of a regulation in a way that protects them, shields them from competition, so that they can earn more. And so how do we assess the extent to which that's the case? Well, we essentially test the idea that was pointed out back a few years ago by Sam Peltzman. So we look at a system where there are different constituencies. There are voters, perhaps, at least in democracies, and there are companies. Companies want to protect their position. The voters, who are also the consumers, want to pay less. And so we look at how the relative importance of these constituencies and the change in their power over time shapes the design of regulation. So with respect to the incumbent companies, so the cell phone carriers, what we are going to look at is a measure of the extent to which they have politicians in their pockets, or more precisely on their boards or in top corporate positions. And we developed two measures of experience that extend a bit the work that I did back in 2006. So one was to look at having top employees, which includes board members and executives, but is not limited to those, who are politicians, government ministers or members of parliaments. We look at those who are currently politicians or were currently at a particular year or had been politicians at some point in the past, so still have their political ties. We use this as a measure of a politician. At the limit, think of a cell phone carrier having the Minister of Telecommunication on their board, something that happens not infrequently. Second measure of political ties, which captures expertise but not political influence, is to have a staffer of a politician as a board member or in a key position. These people obviously have access to the person of the politician, but don't vote. They don't make political choices. So they know what the regulations are about. They might exert some pressure over the politician, but they don't have the ultimate say. So we are going to use these measures to examine the role of influence by the carriers versus the role of information that the political connections could bring. So what we would expect, according to the economic theory of regulation, is that when the carriers have political connections in place, they may want to use them to shape a regulation that protects them against competition. At the same time, the carriers are not the only set of agents that shape the political process. As voters, we also do. And so when a country is more of a democracy or when there is more a turnover in government, obviously politicians have to start paying attention to voters as well. So we are going to look at these competing forces and their role in shaping the regulatory choices. So in this table, it's just a picture of the prevalence of political connections in the mobile telecommunication industry. Again, we see quite a bit of variety across countries. What I'm going to use and exploit in the one table I'm going to show you next, which is going to be the last result, is time series variation in political connections. And we are going to tie time series variation in political connections with time series variation in regulatory choices. So we want to put on the side everything that is purely country specific and time invariant. We do that because we can do that by including country fixed effects. And by doing that, we can focus. So we have the country fixed effects here. We can isolate how regulation changes over time as political connections change. Remember that our measure of regulation is a measure of how pro-competition the regulation is. And so what we find is that the greater the incidence of political connections among people covering the top positions in the mobile operators of a given country, the less pro-competition is the regulation. This could happen in two ways. So the political connections could be consequence of regulations that are anti-competitive. So when the regulations are anti-competitive, firms in those industries seek the connections to maintain the status quo. I'm happier as a monopolist. Or they could be the cause of the regulatory choices. And so if I'm in a position, in a situation where the regulation is pro-competition, I might try to appoint politicians on the boards to then pressure them to change the regulation a lot or a little bit to make it more favorable to my business. These coefficients are standardized. And so a way to read this result is that in the time series, one standard deviation increase in political connections is associated with 1/5 of a standard deviation decline in the extent to which the regulation is pro-competition. We differentiate between the political connections where the company has the politician on the board versus when they have somebody who works for the politician, where this person, this somebody, does not have political power. We don't find anything from that channel, which would be more plausibly an information channel. We control for variety of country level factors that are at least potentially time varying. In practice, we know that corruption doesn't change a lot, but we make an effort to control for corruption and the extent to which changes over time. Executive constraints is a measure of the extent to which a country is democratic. We would expect that in more democratic countries, politicians pay more attention to the interests of voters. Voters don't want to overpay for a cell phone contract. So in more democratic countries, we should expect regulations that are more pro-competition. That's almost the case, but it's not really quite significant. P-value is higher than 0.10. But regardless to what we control for, we can also add here fixed effects. But the coefficient of political connections really barely changes. We find a really, really strong, large in magnitude, a negative correlation between connections and regulations. Seems that the presence, again, of political connections leads to regulations that are more anti-competitive, that generate redistributions of wealth from cell phone carriers to consumers. So I will conclude that it's over an hour that I've been talking way too much for my taste, then take questions. I haven't seen any raised hands, so I presume that there hasn't been any, but there will be an opportunity to chat. So I start my presentation by noting with a couple of statements or observations. So governments exert a lot of influence over business, but businesses also, in many cases, exert a lot of influence over governments and the political process. And so these observations have been the starting point for a lot of research in financial economics on interactions between governments and firms. And so questions that have been addressed or investigated, at least in part, are when do firms get involved in the political process and how do they get involved? So you can think of comparing corporate political connections with lobbying, with campaign contributions, and so forth. To the extent that government intervention, let's go back to the example of taxes, is potentially detrimental to firm value, what do firms do to react to political choices? And last, to the extent that some forms of government intervention could be beneficial to firms, well, what do firms do to ensure that the type of intervention is maintained? And what are the precise channels through which this particular type of government intervention, for example, regulation, affects the value of firms? Obviously, an important question that is much more difficult to address than those that I have, the examples that I have been discussed, is the extent to which, in general, governments are really intervening in the economy to address the presence of frictions and market failures, versus the possibility that the government might itself being the source of frictions and market failures, and government intervention might be a source of distortions rather than a remedy to distortions. So I will stop sharing and see if there are any hands. Any questions? Please don't be shy. So there is one hand. Let's see, how do I? No. Okay. Bhavik.
Hi, very nice presentation. Thank you. My question is a little bit related to how, like, you're talking about political connections and
Please
how
speak closer to the microphone.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. So my question is pretty much related to how, you are showing that telecommunication and the executives are forming a part to control regulation. Is this common across, would you be able to confidently be able to say, is this common across many industries, or that, especially in the agricultural industry where, we have a lot of issues, and the tech industry, or is it your paper basically, which focuses on telecommunication, is it only common, this type of political connection in telecom, but not very common in other industries?
So in the last paper, we only focused on telecoms. But in my first paper in 2006, I actually looked at many different industries. So we did not choose the telecom industry because connections being especially prevalent. Rather, we chose that industry because regulation being especially important. And also because of the industry being an oligopoly, if not a monopoly, because of regulatory choices. Over time, I have seen not too much effort on the part of scholars in trying to update 2006 cross-country data that I had developed. But I think that now the opportunity exists to actually do some work and develop measures of connections that encompass many different industries and many different countries. And so in the paper with Luigi, we actually developed a parsing program that can be used to read bias. For example, we use the Capital IQ. That parsing program is available on my website. And so if you're interested in this type of questions, you can download it and use it to identify the extent of prevalence of political connections across different industries, across many different countries and over time. Obviously, having the big data and more data is many ways the way to the future. And I think that now the opportunities do exist, but we only looked at telecommunication.